Daniel Beers.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I'm Daniel Beers. Thank you for the invitation to do this. I appreciate it. So I teach in the Department of Justice Studies at JMU, and I quite a long time ago decided to specialize in post-communist politics, and I've kind of changed. My work has evolved since then. But in the early part of my academic career, I spent time in Romania and Ukraine specifically. I actually worked for a USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. government-funded project with the Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament. For a few years, I worked as a research assistant with them, based mostly in Indiana, but traveling to Kiev occasionally, and actually spent the summer there. I think it was in 2005. So I've studied post-communist developments in the interim period, and I've also started to look at humanitarian aid and international development assistance globally. And so as we're watching this war happen in Ukraine and the outflow of refugees, it's kind of all of my interests coming to combine in one horrible knot. And so I've been watching this really closely and hope to share just a little bit about the background of the crisis, how Ukraine got to this point, as well as the kind of humanitarian implications. So I've been asked to just speak for 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll do questions. But if you want to interrupt me, since most of the folks are here in the room, I'm happy to just have a back and forth. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get started. So as I'm sure most of us know, this started with the buildup of troops on the borders with Ukraine. These are some satellite images showing, military forces being gathered on the border, both the Russian border and the Belarusian border of Ukraine. So here's a map that kind of shows us what that looks like. So Ukraine is bordered, roughly half of its border it shares with Russia, so all the way around here, and then a bit in the north with Belarus. And Belarus has worked really cooperatively, really I would say in collaboration with Moscow throughout this invasion. And so forces have come from the north directly from Belarus, but also from the east and south from Russia. So on February 24th, right, we saw this full-scale attack on Ukraine. And I will say, prior to that, there was obviously a lot of talk about the tension and the escalation of tensions in the region. But Putin has done these sorts of things in the past. He has staged relatively small-scale military incursions for a week or two at a time, and has kept it relatively limited. He's carved off little pieces of territory, even in Ukraine, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that there would be a full-scale invasion like the one that we're seeing. And I think I'm not alone, right? Most analysts, including even the Secretary General of the United Nations, said he himself was caught by surprise when the invasion actually happened. I've been teaching classes throughout this period, and every time we meet, we check in about what's going on in Ukraine. And I've been able to take these screenshots of the New York Times twice a week for over 4 weeks now, and I can't recall a time when a story has kept the focus of global attention like this. So it's obviously a really important story for the world. So one of the things we saw initially with the invasion was these convoys of tanks and armored vehicles coming in from many directions. So here's a map that kind of gives us a sense of just sort of the overwhelming force and how many different places and different ways that Russia was attacking Ukraine all at once. So the blue lines here show invasion routes, right? Both what we said from Belarus and from Russia itself, in several different parts of the borderlands. We also saw these orange dots are air and missile strikes. And one of the things you see very clearly straight away is that this is happening all over the country. And then these areas that are shaded in pink or red are territories that Russia controls. And this map is from fairly early on in the invasion, I would say within the first week of fighting. So straight away, they're capturing some territory on those border regions. One of the other things that we're seeing is, so in response to that, Ukrainian forces organized immediately to resist invasion. And one of the things that they did was to just make it really, really hard for Russians to make progress towards major cities and in particular the capital city of Kiev. And if you're wondering about the pronunciation of the city, I will just say right now. So Kiev is the Russian way of pronouncing the city. It's spelled K-I-E-V in transliteration from the Cyrillic. Kyiv, as you're hearing, or Kyiv, right? If you actually use the diphthong, is K-Y-I-V. That is the Ukrainian way of spelling and saying the name. So if you're confused about that and wondering why all of a sudden a bunch of journalists like a month ago changed the way they pronounced it, it's because they spent time in Ukraine and they heard the Ukrainian language way of pronouncing it, and they decided to use the Ukrainian way. So anyway, these are forces outside Kyiv, and these are anti-tank. They're called hedgehogs. They're actually when they're manufactured, they're made in the Czech Republic. That's where they come from in the region. But they're just these steel crossbars that are welded together, and they do a pretty good job of stopping tanks and armored vehicles, at least for a temporary period of time. One of the other things that we saw was airstrikes, right? And we mentioned this in the previous map, but I just wanted to kind of call attention to it because it is one of the things that makes this war so terrifying: the indiscriminate violence and the inability to know when bombs will be falling from the sky. And you can see here pretty clearly from the map. This is again from even the first week of the war. There's really no part of the country that is clearly safe from attack. You've probably been hearing stories that in the west of Ukraine, over here, particularly in the city of Lviv, which is actually the Ukrainian way of pronouncing it, but you'll hear Lviv, Lviv. Lviv is how Ukrainians say it. It actually at one time was a Polish city. It has very strong linkages to other parts of Central Europe. And was kind of largely spared from the attack. And many Ukrainians actually fled to the west, particularly to Lviv, because it's a major hub, cultural and economic hub, and a transit hub. But just a couple of days ago, there was a strike on the city itself. It's beginning to be. So there really is nowhere that is fully safe inside of Ukraine. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these border regions in a few minutes. So this is just some of the pictures of the effects of the attacks, and I'm sure you've all seen these. I don't need to belabor it. But when I talk to my students about what's going on there, I would say that one of the key takeaways for me is that this is just there's no regard for civilian casualties. There's no regard for human life. I do firmly agree that the Kremlin is committing war crimes in Ukraine. It's very clear that they're targeting civilian infrastructure and targets. I meant to grab a picture of this, I forgot. One of the most striking for me was a theater complex in Mariupol, which is a city in the south. They've been using it as a shelter for Ukrainians who were looking for a place to be safe during the bombardments. And they had written on the ground in very large white letters the Russian word for children on both sides, so you could read it from the air, and then you can look online and see pictures of this theater, the before and after, and it was reduced to rubble by an airstrike, and hundreds of people, if not more, were trapped under the rubble for days. It was an absolute horrific tragedy. There was a bombing of a maternity hospital, apartment buildings, shopping malls, all kinds of things that are very clearly not military targets. And I will say, just by way of commentary, Putin has shown himself to be capable of these things already in the past. There's been a very bloody conflict in Chechnya for a number of years, and Russians are actively involved in the Syrian conflict as well, and have been, killing civilians indiscriminately using particularly cluster munitions, which are these bombs that carry lots of little bombs inside of them, and when they explode, they spew shrapnel everywhere, and they're just very very dangerous and indiscriminate killing machines. So I don't have the audio for this. If you're interested, you can look these up. This is a picture of President Zelensky, who, if you've been following the backstory, he was a comedian and an actor in Ukraine, a fairly successful one. He actually organized something like a sort of comic version of American Idol for Ukrainian comedians. And he also starred in a TV show in which he played the Ukrainian president. And that was several years before he decided to run for office. And so in 2019, he ran for office, won actually 70% of the vote. So he was very popular, basically parlayed that, that presidential sort of, I don't know, demeanor, I guess, and the ability to envision him, right, in the presidential position. And there's a lot of cynicism and a lot of, just disgust with politics in Ukraine. And so he was an opposition candidate. He rode on a wave of dissent against establishment politicians. When he got into office, people didn't really expect very much from him. He ran on an anti-corruption platform, and he seemed to be in the early times, trying to make efforts toward that, but he ran into some problems with information leaks and problems kind of getting his agenda carried out, and so he actually started replacing some of his closest allies in the presidential administration with close friends, personal friends, and even extended family members. And then when corruption scandals started to arise, started looking the other way, right? You know the story. And so by the time of the Russian invasion, people were not super happy with Zelensky, and his approval ratings were fairly low, and he seemed to be kind of an ineffectual president. And so this kind of the way the tide has turned, in the way in which he has captured the public imagination, I think, during this war is really quite incredible. But as you all know, he chose to stay in Ukraine during the invasion. He was given a golden parachute. He could have taken the plane ride out with any number of Western allies, and he chose to stay and said the fight is here, and I need an ammunition, not a ride, was his tweet, right? And so every day he does these social media posts. You notice just from the picture, right? It's a selfie video. So he's using the way of communication of younger people and being able to, create, like, bridge that distance between the political leaders and the people that many politicians have trouble with, and in particular in post-communist regions, there's often a very large divide there. And if you contrast that with like pictures you've maybe seen of Putin sitting at the end of these very long tables or in these incredible stately rooms where he's here and all of his advisors are on the other side of the room, right? It's the opposite kind of effect that he's going for here. But he shows up with his prime minister, his cabinet ministers, his top advisors in these videos every single day to say, I'm still here, I'm still fighting, we still have not lost. In fact, the very first line of the Ukrainian national anthem is Ukraine is still here, right? Because the history of the nation has been threatened for its entire existence. And so he's sending that message clearly to the people, and it's been incredible the way it has galvanized the Ukrainian opposition to the war. We've also seen, right, regular people organizing. This is from early on as well, a kind of cottage industry of Molotov cocktail manufacturing. In fact, down here you can't really see the image very well, but there was a brewery in Kyiv that actually stopped production of beer and made these special printed labels that have, it's kind of a political cartoon type thing of Putin sitting naked on the throne, and there's lots of commentary in the image. But they are now manufacturing Molotov cocktails in the facility that used to make beer. And so, this is just regular citizens trying to defend their cities from, a full scale attack. This photo was one that has really stuck with me and really affected me, still does actually. These are volunteer troops that, they're conscripts. They've signed up for the Ukrainian National Territorial Defense Force. The woman in the middle here, she was a school teacher. They interviewed her in the paper that I got this photo from. And she had never held a gun 2 days before this picture was taken, had never any experience with the military, never imagined doing anything like this. And is clearly, upset about what this means for her future and the future of her country. But this is just one of many stories like this. It's kind of amazing to see the way that Ukrainians have rallied to defend their country against incredible odds. One of the other things that we've seen, and I'm going to talk a little more about this at the end of the conversation, is an outpouring of Ukrainian refugees. We're up to almost 4 million at this point, at the just over 1 month mark. And you see most of them are going right to the south and west, into other parts of Eastern Europe that are more closely aligned with the EU and NATO. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. There's a major displacement crisis. About a quarter of the Ukrainian population right now is forced to be displaced. So how did we get here? And forgive me, because first of all, I'm not a historian, and secondly, we're going to walk through like hundreds of years of history in a very short period of time. But I want to make a basic point here, right? One is that the history of Ukraine is a history of imperialism, imperial occupation, right, and sort of shifting borders over time, and a struggle to even exist and have autonomy and independence as a people. So we see this, and I also want to address the claims that Putin has made about Ukraine being a fictive state, really just part of Russia, not worthy of autonomy or independence. So the basis of this claim goes back to the 9th century or the 10th century, I guess, with the formation of a loose federation of Slavic tribes, which was known as Kievan Rus. So they were this empire. It was a loose empire. It wasn't really very highly organized, but it was a contemporary with the Byzantine Empire that helps all in your sort of global history to frame what we're talking about here. Importantly, right, Kievan Rus included the territory present-day Moscow, which is around here. Wasn't really much of a city at that point, but the cultural and economic capital of Kievan Rus was Kiev. And so both Ukrainians and Russians and many other Slavic peoples actually trace their origins back to this imperial period. It lasted under 3 centuries, and it was ultimately broken up by the Mongols. So my point is that like this is there's a famous book called Imagined Communities about the origins of nationalism, and the idea is essentially that all national identities are imagined, right? We find ways to identify ourselves and distinguish ourselves from others based on language, religion, race, common experience, geography. But what links one people together and separates them from another is all in our minds, right? And so this is an imagination of where where the Russian people are from and what their cultural historical lineage should be, or domain, right? Their political domain, as well as it is for anybody else. So I'm gonna blow through some other monarchies here really quick. The Mongols were incredible. The Mongols had the largest contiguous land empire in the entire world in the history of the world. It spread all the way from China in the east through to, it got to the gates of, it doesn't show it on this map, but the Mongol invaders actually went all the way to the gates of the Vatican, right? And they firmly controlled the territory of present-day Ukraine and a large part of Russia in the 13th century. First under, well, Genghis Khan didn't get this far, but he conquered a lot of this territory and the Mongols kept going. Okay, so Ukraine even wasn't under this federation of Slavic tribes continuously. It was under Mongol control. Later, it was under control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I know this map's going to be a little hard to orient ourselves, so what I can do is kind of flip over here. So these are the present-day borders, right? So you see most of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states up here, and most of Poland. If we go back here, right? So here is Kijo. I don't know how to pronounce it in Polish, but this is Kiev, right? This is Kiev. So firmly in the Polish Lithuanian Empire, and then later gets swallowed up partly by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the west and south, and by the Russian Empire to the east, right? There is a period of brief independence for a portion of what is present-day Ukraine, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But my basic point here, right, is this is the story that the Russians are telling, that Russian nationalists, and Putin specifically is telling, that Ukraine, or a large portion of Ukraine, right? So here's Kiev in this map, has belonged to Russia for at least a couple hundred years, and then actually, if you trace the kind of cultural ancestry of the Russian people, it goes directly to Kiev and Kiev in the Russian telling, and therefore, it is territory that should rightfully be under Russian control. So I also want to talk about a modern day empire, right, which is the Soviet Union. And this is the one that we all know and that gets talked about a lot more often. obviously Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union of Socialist Republics. It was in many ways the most important republic outside of Russia itself. So at the time of the Soviet Union, there were about 150 million Russians in Russia and about 40 some odd million Ukrainians, right? So it was much smaller than Russia, but the by far the second largest by population. The other countries, I think were in the 20, 30 millions tops. It was also really important culturally, like we've been talking about. Kyiv is a cultural capital of Slavic peoples. It was an important economic hub. It was important in production of grain and foodstuffs. It was an important site for military installations and weapon silos. Right, so Ukraine was just critically important to the Soviet Union. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, in many ways, it's more important than almost any other state that left the Soviet Union besides Russia itself. And if you remember the story of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there's a period they refer to as the Parade of Sovereignties. So essentially, Russia was the metropole, was the core of the empire, controlled the other territories. But as after the fall of the Berlin Wall and many of these countries behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak, that were not directly controlled by Soviet Union, but very closely aligned and under pressure from the Warsaw Pact. Once they split away in 1989 and early 1990, then we started to see several of the countries in the actual Soviet Union proper declaring sovereignty. This was the Parade of Sovereignties. And in December of, Ukraine did it, I think, in August of 1991, and Russia itself actually seceded from the Soviet Union in December of 1991. So when the core separates from the empire, it doesn't exist anymore, right? Okay, so that brings us to the post-Soviet period, right? And I think Russia would say the Western Empire. And what we saw are two major expansions in the post-Soviet space. One is an expansion of military control and influence in the form of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the other is in the expansion of the European Union. So we're probably all familiar with NATO. This is this military alliance that was created in response to the partition of Berlin and to basically stop further Russian incursion into Western democratic territories. And so it's a Cold War relic, right? But it is also a really important military alliance throughout Western Europe. And after those countries, particularly behind the Iron Curtain, but not actually former Soviet republics, most of them, so places like Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia after they split, Hungary, right, Romania, Bulgaria, these countries were fairly early on in the expansion of NATO, and then later we get these countries like the Baltics here, Estonia, Lithuania, that join a little bit later. And really what you see is just the sort of the movement of Western influence and military alliance closer and closer to the borders with Russia. And Putin was unhappy with this the whole time it was happening. But Ukraine was always sort of the line in the sand. And so he said this is not acceptable because of Ukraine's historical importance, because of the large border that it shares with Russia, and because of the cultural heritage and all of this, for Ukraine to join this Western military alliance. Something similar we could say about the European Union, right? So these are the wave of enlargements that have made the EU bigger. If you remember, or if you ever learned about this, the European Union started as something called the European Coal and Steel Community, which was an economic alliance between just some core countries: Germany, France, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and Italy. I think those were the core countries at the founding. And it was really intended to bind them together economically so that they could not fight each other in war by linking their networks of coal and steel, right? Like the main resources they would need to fight a major land war in Europe again. And then it expanded as this really large political and economic project over time. And to some logical places in Western Europe, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, etc., Greece, and then into Eastern Europe, right? And there was a super enlargement, it was called, in 2004, where many of these same countries, right, the Baltics here, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, actually at the time, Hungary, Slovenia, and then 3 years later, Romania and Bulgaria joined in 2007 the European Union. And this was, again, seen as this kind of push towards Westernization and Western alliance of these countries that used to be firmly under the control of the Soviet Union and the direct influence of Moscow. So this is the major grievance, right, that Putin has been talking about. So I want to talk a little bit about Ukrainian identity. I said during that period of time where we talked about empires, right, and the kind of occupation that Ukraine experienced, there was a period of time, 4-year period of time, right, where there was an independent Ukrainian state controlled by the Zaporizhian Cossacks, right? So the Cossacks, I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on this topic, but the Cossacks were cavalry, right? They were horsemen and soldiers, and the part of the Russian Empire that they were ultimately incorporated into was a part that was very hard for Russia to pacify, and they maintained a certain level of autonomy, and they had a reputation for being, let's say, feisty, right, and difficult to control. And they did have their own independent state at one point, right, even though it was very short-lived. And so a lot of Ukrainians will say this is where Ukraine started. We're going to fast forward quite a lot to the Soviet Union, right? So after Lenin and the Bolsheviks take control in 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution, they're having a really hard time consolidating all the territory, getting everybody on board with the communist project. And so one of the things that they do is they create this nationalism policy. So they take these constituent republics and they say, Ukraine, you've always wanted your own national identity. We're gonna reify it. We're gonna say, yes, there is a Ukrainian socialist republic. It has a Ukrainian national anthem and a flag and its own language and its own culture that we recognize. And in exchange for that, you're going to essentially pledge your allegiance to the core of the empire in Moscow, right? In alliance with the Union. The nationalist policies were really complicated. Particularly Stalin did some really terrible things in terms of trying to extinguish some minority populations. He expelled actually a fair number of Ukrainians when they were fighting against Moscow. The Tatars did terrible things to the Chechens and even the Georgians, actually where Stalin himself was from. But there was a movement, there was a manipulation of identity and a movement of peoples as a way of political control during the Soviet Union is my basic point here. And it is also one of the things that, so Putin actually explicitly rejects the Soviet legacy. He says that we essentially need to go back to the Russian Empire. He wants to be a czar, right? Not a Soviet leader, because of this nationality policy and the sort of, fake nationalism as in his view. But in trying to control these different populations, it was always a balancing act. They would recognize the autonomy, they would recognize the culture and the language, but they would also systematically oppress or repress those populations whenever they tried to challenge Moscow's dominance. And so the most important example of this in Ukraine was a man-made famine in the early 1930s called the Holodomor, which was under Stalin. It was during one of the early 5-year plans. And his goal was, so if you know anything about kind of Soviet development and Soviet rule, communism, I don't mean to take this deep dive, communism wasn't supposed to happen in Russia, right? Or in these republics. It was supposed to be the natural outgrowth of advanced industrial capitalism. It was supposed to happen in Germany or the UK, right? And that's actually where Marx and Engels were writing from initially, and it's where they imagined the communist revolution to happen. Instead, it was ideologues in Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who took up the helm and they said, okay, cool, we're going to impose this here. But in order to do that, we have to fast forward through the whole process of capitalist industrialization in order to get to this post-capitalist utopia. And so they had this series of 5-year economic plans. And one of the things that they did was forced collectivization of peasants and agriculture. So they took a bunch of people who were basically they were serfs, or they were peasants. They farmed the land, they fed themselves, they traded a little bit for extra, but that was it. It was a very simple lifestyle. It was not a lucrative or very efficient farming practice. So Stalin pushed a lot of peasants onto these forcibly collectivized farms. And the big reason for this was they wanted to produce more food so that they could urbanize more quickly and industrialize in the cities and push the Soviet Union further ahead in the development process. Does that make sense? I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but like, I don't know if I'm telling this coherently. So the Holodomor was a period of time where the crops failed. And instead of allowing Ukrainians to keep what little bit that they were able to produce, they came and took them anyway. They took the allotments that were required according to the 5-year plan, and they sealed off the borders, and they allowed people to starve. And so these are bags of grain that are being collected from starving people, right, and transported out of the villages in Ukraine by Moscow into other parts of the Soviet Union. So in many ways, this is a really important moment in the development of Ukrainian national identity, because it is very clearly Moscow oppressing and even, many call this an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people in the heart of the Soviet period. We're going to fast forward again. Another important event, although I think less important, but still worth mentioning, was Chernobyl. Right, this was everybody knows what happened more or less. The reactor melted down, and it was the largest nuclear disaster that we've seen. But the thing that you don't necessarily know about the story is that Moscow tried to deny that this was happening for several days. There was actually a Soviet parade that was scheduled in the city of Chernobyl a few days after the meltdown. They held it anyway. And then you started to see the clouds kind of wafting over and people getting sick, and it was impossible to control the story any longer. And when it came out, Ukrainian people were outraged, of course, that this would happen, and that Moscow would try to cover it up and disregard the welfare of their own people. So Chernobyl is near the border with Belarus, not too far actually from Kyiv. And this happened in 1986. So it's a period of time when obviously the Soviet system is in a lot of turmoil already, and a lot of people see this as one of the major events that kind of helped tip the balance in favor of the collapse of the system and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So in 1981, we get this is during the Parade of Sovereignties. Sorry, I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. It made sense when I put the slides together. This is a referendum for Ukrainian independence. Over 92% of Ukrainians nationwide voted for independence from the Soviet Union. And that includes majorities in every single district of the Ukrainian state, including the Crimea down here. We'll get to this after a sec, which was heavily Russified and heavily Russian, meaning still it was like 56% of Crimeans voted for independence from the Soviet Union. So really important marker in the development of independent, sovereign Ukrainian nationhood. Like this is when it becomes truly its own state. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of like what state was left there in terms of the Ukrainian national identity. If you listen to people's commentary about Ukrainian political opinion and Ukrainian identity, one of the things you'll hear is that it was for a number of years a divided country. These maps aren't great, but they give you a general sense. In general, people in the east and the south of Ukraine tended to be more pro-Russian in attitude. This map shows you the percentage of population that actually identified Russian as their native language, right? So pretty much all Ukrainians will speak both Russian and Ukrainian, and they do some code switching depending on like the political circumstance or the social circumstance. It's very interesting. If you spend time in Kyiv, like at least up until a month ago, you would hear just as much Russian as you would Ukrainian. And part of that has to do with like political leanings and attitudes, but part of it also has to do with that Soviet nationalities policy and the fact that the Russians tried to basically pack South and Eastern Ukraine with ethnic Russians, and in particular in Crimea, because this was such an important Sevastopol, the military or the naval base, was really important strategically to the Soviet Union. So in some ways, it's just a relic of kind of the movement of peoples by the Soviet government. But those opinions and those affiliations continued, right, after independence. There were still lots of people in Eastern Ukraine who said, yeah, I'm Russian, I'm Ukrainian, but I'm also Russian. And I speak Russian language at home. I have family across the border in Russia, and I want a closer association with Russia because it feels natural and normal. And so you saw this actually even reflected, in the country's politics. So here's a political map of the February 2010 presidential election. We could talk all about the different elections, but I don't think we really need to get into that. My basic point here, right, is the color coding is the same, and you can see Viktor Yanukovych, who he'll come up as a character in the story I'm about to tell. He's kind of a Russian stooge, I will put it that way. He's a very close ally of Putin, and he's very pro-Russian in policy. And you can see the parts of Ukraine that supported him in the presidential election versus those who supported Yulia Tymoshenko, who was the pro-Western, European Union, NATO kind of candidate. So this is all pre-2014, so just keep that in mind. Okay, I want to also say there's been a couple of events that have kind of punctuated the recent independent history of Ukraine. First one was what was called the Orange Revolution in 2004. This was when Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russia guy we were just talking about, was running against Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych. I'm sorry. Yeah, am I saying that right? Viktor Yushchenko, excuse me. Yeah, Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko. I don't have a picture of him, but he was poisoned by something called dioxin. It's one of he was disfigured, right? He has like crippling pain, and a lot of people think that this was a FSB, like a Russian Secret Service job, because he was the pro-Western candidate, challenging the government. So essentially, what happened in the 2004 election? This is very rough generalization. There was election fraud. The pro-Russian candidate declared victory. The pro-Western candidates said there was fraud. And then there was this huge uprising in the streets for months, actually. In the middle of winter in Kyiv and other cities throughout Ukraine, people were demonstrating. This is where my orange scarf is from, right? Yushchenko. This was their electoral slogan. I like when I have props. So it's called the Orange Revolution because this was the color of the political candidates, right, that were running. And ultimately, what happened was a political compromise. The pro-Russian candidate decided they accepted defeat in the election, but they changed the constitution to weaken the presidency so that they wouldn't be able to do as much essentially when they took power. We see a kind of reprise of this in 10 years later in 2014, and if there's one day in recent Ukrainian history that I think is important to understand, it's this one. This was triggered not by an election, but actually by a political decision by Viktor Yanukovych. So, if you remember, this was the pro-Russia guy, right, that lost in 2004 because of electoral fraud and that compromise. He ran again. So Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko didn't manage the economy very well. They didn't do very well, and they had limited powers because of the constitutional change. And so they became unpopular, and they actually lost legitimately in 2010, in the 2010 presidential election. So in power, who won? Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Russia guy, right? The guy who was ousted in the Orange Revolution. He actually legitimately wins in 2010, and he takes power. 4 years later, so he's trying to more closely align Ukraine with Russia, right, and move away from the East. Well, he had promised, and previous Ukrainian leaders had promised that Ukraine was going to move closer towards EU membership, and in what was called an association agreement. And he was supposed to sign this in the fall of 2014, and at the very last minute, he backed out and said, "We're not going to do it." People were outraged, and they came into the streets, very much like what happened in 2004. But this time it started out peaceful, and it started very similarly, and then it became quite violent. This was a bit of a surreal moment for me. I was teaching at the time in Illinois, but I had spent some time in Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which is the central Independence Square in downtown Kyiv. That's where the office was, where I worked the summer that I was there. And these barricades are directly in front of our office, right? Like they set up a war zone essentially in downtown Kyiv. And people came armed like with soccer shin guards and garbage can lids as shields. They were wearing motorcycle helmets, baseball bats, like anything they could to protect themselves from the riot police called the Berkut, who were very heavy-handed with the protesters. Because remember, who's in charge but the pro-Russian Yanukovych, who wants to extinguish this protest and move closer to Russia. Ultimately, this gets very, very bloody and very violent. Like on both sides, there are right-wing, I would say neo-fascist Ukrainian nationalists in the mix here. They're white power nationalists, like they are anti-Semites. They're pretty terrible, but they are fighting with the pro-Ukrainian forces, and that is part of where this like Nazi fascist kind of rhetoric comes from, because there is a kernel of truth in that there are these far right-wing nationalist groups that do fight alongside Ukrainian forces against Russia. There were examples where the Berkut vehicles were actually set on fire with the riot police inside them. I mean, it was ugly. What ultimately happened was Yanukovych flees to Russia. He basically loses the confidence of Putin, and he leaves. He takes shelter in Russia. There's an amazing thing that happens. They discover his personal mansion inside Kiev, which is actually technically legally registered in London. I don't know if you know how like the sort of shell companies and legal entities to move money around the world. Anyway, it had like a replica pirate ship in it. It had like its own pond and all kinds of stuff. Like TV in every bathroom. Everything is gold plated. It was absurd. But people stormed them, and they took pictures of themselves like sitting on his toilet and whatever else, swimming in his swimming pool. He actually dumped a lot of his files into his swimming pool. It's really smart. Anyway, what soon followed, though, this was a humiliation for Putin and for the pro-Russian side of things. And so soon after, in the early winter of 2014, started. So the revolution thing started in 2013. In early 2014, Russian forces annexed Crimea. This is what they looked like. They didn't have any insignia on their uniforms or on their vehicles. The Ukrainians called them little green men, like Martians that just sort of came from outer space or something. Everybody knew they were Russians, but Russia didn't claim responsibility for it until they had occupied the entire Crimean Peninsula. And what you also saw was, out of a lot of the conflict that's happening in Kyiv and other cities in the West, there was an independence movement in the far east part of Ukraine, which was a pro-Russian movement where you had these really pro-Russian extremists that claimed capital. What do I say? Like city hall, basically, of some of these cities and towns in the regions of Lugansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, called the Donbas region. And they set up barricades, and they were like, we are not siding with the West. We're not going to accept this pro-democratic, pro-EU government. Like, we are splitting from Ukraine and we're going to Russia forcibly. And so ever since that period of time, there has been a separatist war in eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years. And it has been heavily supplied and supported by the Kremlin, as you can imagine, right? They send Russian soldiers to train them. They supply them with weapons. They can move freely across the border with Russia. And in Crimea, it has been an occupied territory ever since. So since 2014. Why is this important in Ukrainian history? I mean, I think for a couple of reasons. One is that it showed firstly that Putin was willing to use military force and actually occupy territory in a sovereign country in order to start to reclaim some of the influence, right, and the power in the region that he wanted. And I think secondly, it's important because it galvanized political opinion inside Ukraine against Russia. And that's a piece of the story that I think Putin and many others kind of failed to understand, which was that prior to 2014, Ukraine really was a kind of divided nation, and there were a lot of pro-Russian people in the East and South specifically, But you started to see, if you watch the public opinion polls, year after year, it became more and more firmly pro-Ukrainian independence and anti-Russian, right? So you would see these polls where people would ask, like, is Russia ultimately a positive or negative influence in Ukraine? And you would see 70% or more of Ukrainian people all over the country saying mostly negative, right? Which was a sea change in terms of public opinion and identity inside Ukraine. And it was because of this really terrible and pretty ugly, bloody civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine that was really sponsored by Russia. So it was already a country at war. It was already, under the thumb of Russia in many ways. And then we had this full-scale invasion that we talked about at the beginning. And so the last thing I wanted to just highlight here was the humanitarian emergency that has followed. And I think this is something that all of us have probably been watching. We've seen these pictures in the early days of these huge, lines, traffic jams for miles at the borders to, especially in Western Ukraine, to enter neighboring countries like Poland and Romania and Moldova. This is a map that's a little bit, there's a lot going on in here, but I want to just talk through a couple of things because I think it tells us a lot. So this is actually from, the European Commission puts out this map every single day, and this one is from yesterday. So as of yesterday, we saw 2,293,833 refugees flee to Poland. So 2.25 million refugees to Poland, almost 600,000 Ukrainian refugees to Romania, almost 400,000 to Moldova, 350,000 to Hungary, 275,000 to Slovakia. So all told, I can't do the math that fast in my head, but we're really close to 4 million. Okay, 3.86 million officially registered refugees in neighboring countries. What the map also shows us is is movement inside Ukraine. So one of the things we're seeing, right, is in these places where the places that are seeing the brunt of the fighting, places like Kherson, Nikolaev here, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv in the north. These are places where people are fleeing, west to try to get away from the fighting, as well as in Kyiv. So this used to be the arrows used to point towards Kyiv, but now that it's become much more of an active fighting zone, people are moving further west, right? So you're seeing a lot of internal movement towards the west in Ukraine. These people who are displaced by violence, but they are not actually fleeing across the border, are called internally displaced persons, or IDPs. It's a terribly dehumanizing term, in my opinion. But they have, think of them as domestic refugees, right? So if you combine these, and they stay for lots of different reasons, right? They stay because they don't want to leave Ukraine. They stay because they don't want to leave their family. They stay because they can't get out. They're disabled. They have health conditions. There's all kinds of reasons why people don't actually leave the country altogether. But they're effectively domestic refugees. And so if you add all these together, you have over 10 million people who are forcibly displaced by fighting in the last month. And this is a country of 44 million people. So it's almost a quarter of the entire population of Ukraine is forcibly displaced by this conflict in just a matter of a few weeks. We could say more about kind of where people are going and why and that kind of stuff. The last thing I will say is that there has been this kind of tremendous outpouring of support, both regionally and globally. I've never seen anything like this. I've been watching this field for many years, and I think there's lots of reasons for it. We can talk about it if you want to. But these are some of the spontaneous groups, setting up tents and feeding stations, and there's beautiful images of like one of the bridges between Ukraine and a bordering country, I think in Poland. They set up stuffed animals along the bridge so that kids could take one as they're crossing over. People have just done amazing things to open their homes and their hearts to Ukrainians in need. This is a picture from Berlin, actually. So it's far, west is Berlin, where people are waiting at the train station saying, I can take one mother and two kids, one mother and one child, right? Just saying like, we're here for you if you need us. But I will also say that I've been working on a project. I'm hoping to go to Romania and to look at this stuff in a field research project. And one of the people I just got in touch with in the last couple of days is working on the dark underbelly of this, which is the increased risk of human trafficking at the border as people are opening up their homes and there's just this massive flux of people and very little understanding of who's there, where they're going, very little controls. It's conditions that are ripe for abuse, which is horrific, horror upon horror, but unfortunately the world that we live in. So I'm gonna stop there. There's been protests in Russia as well, but yeah, I'm I'm sorry if that went too long, but I'm happy to continue conversations if you want.
So, how large is the Ukraine territory in comparison to some place that we know?
Anybody know this? It's very large. I want to say like Texas.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you back me up? All right. I'm not sure, but it's very large. It's a good question.
But 40 million people in Texas would be pretty compact.
Pretty densely populated area, yeah. Yeah, don't she's looking it up.
His wife is sitting out here. Is that good?
Want to speculate on how you think it ends?
Sure. So there's been some really positive developments in the last couple of days, I think. At first, I didn't trust it, but it seems to be holding. Moscow it announced that they have completed the first phase of the invasion, right? So they're claiming victory somehow, and that they're moving on to phase 2, which is focused mainly on the east and south of Ukraine. So basically consolidating territories where they already had a stronghold, from the war in Donbass, and where they've gained more territory since the invasion. Unfortunately, it means places like Mariupol are in the way because it's clear that Russia wants a contiguous territory, probably one that circles the entire Sea of Azov, which is connected to the Black Sea. So you can have this land bridge all the way to Crimea. So I think there's going to be a lot of people in those areas who just bear the unfair brunt of that fighting. And they're going to be reduced to rubble. Like there will be nothing that stops him from trying to take that territory. But I do think that is what the negotiations. So there's been a series of negotiations, especially in Turkey, in the last few times. And Turkey is a country that has good diplomatic relations with both countries, wants to be more of a regional power, and so they're hosting these talks. And it seems like Zelensky is coming with the offer to maintain neutrality, so it won't join NATO or the European Union. But it wants territorial integrity, right? It wants to keep Ukrainian territory. And so that's going to be the sticking point. And I think that it's going to be a bitter pill, right, for Ukrainians to say, yes, you can have some of our country. And what happens to the people who are left behind in those parts of Ukraine? But I think that's the most likely scenario. I think with some sort of partition of the country, whether formal or informal, I think you're likely to see some sort of occupied territory for a long time.
Do you have a sense of how this is impacting citizens in Russia? I know there's a lot of disinformation and a lot of threat about speaking out, but do you have kind of any anecdotes from that?
So it's hard to know, right? Like Russia is an increasingly authoritarian state, has been for the last 20 years. I mean, the authoritarian nature of the government has ratcheted up over time, and the information space has closed, and in particular in recent months. So I think that it's hard to gauge true public opinion based on like polling and that kind of thing. But it does seem that there's a lot of state-run media that is claiming this is a war of defense against Nazi nationalists in Ukraine who are threatening ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine, and enough was enough, and we needed to invade to protect them. That's the narrative. You even have stories of Russian soldiers who are arriving in Ukrainian territory, some of them not knowing that they were even in Ukraine, and then others saying like, we're here to liberate you, right? Like expecting them to be welcome. So I do think like the disinformation campaign has been strong and effective inside Russia. And the fact that like a lot of Western media companies are pulling out, as well as other companies, it means that the country is increasingly isolated. It's harder and harder to find good information. And I mean, so I don't know like what the general public opinion is, but I'm sure that there is a fair portion of the Russian populace that is supportive of Putin's rhetoric, right? And maybe less so of armed conflict, because what is really there to gain. I will say though that there is a vocal minority, right, that have been protesting, and you've actually been seeing like an outflow of tens of thousands of Russians to various parts of Western Europe and also Eastern Europe. In particular, Tbilisi, Georgia has become kind of a hotspot for Russians that are fleeing Russia. And apparently you can't get an apartment in Tbilisi anymore, and they want to be close, but not inside Russia, not subject to threat from the Kremlin. And there's been lots of stories, the Russian Secret Service will stop people on the street and ask to see their cell phone and scroll through their social media and see, are you talking about the war? If you use the word war instead of special military operation, if you are sympathetic with Ukrainians, anything that makes you suspicious to the Kremlin, you can be arrested on sight. And that was a new law that was passed, I don't know, 3 weeks ago. It was a disinformation law, right? So it's really like dystopian stuff that's happening inside Russia, and I think like the economic and social impact of the way these sanctions are rolling out, and the way Russia is being isolated internationally, is going to stick around for a long time. It's going to hurt a lot of people.
So a huge portion of journalists and activists and intelligentsia have all left. I think hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, I think quite a lot. Yeah.
So what's left in Russia is really kind of people who are not actively interested in other news viewpoints, more or less.
Well, or who can't make the choice
Yeah.
to leave, right? I mean, that's the thing. I think there's far more people who just don't have the luxury of leaving.
Yeah.
Don't have the funds. They have responsibilities. They have family. There's all kinds of reasons why. But I do think in the short term, it's probably going to be a more pacified population, and you have a lot less access to good sources of information. But the people who have left, they haven't stopped thinking or writing about Russia. They're still trying to report. They're creating new websites and new Telegram channels and all these things, and they're trying to find other ways to broadcast them back into Russia. And as soon as there's an opening, I'm sure that they will return and continue to push for liberalization. So I mean, I don't think like hope is lost, right? I just think it's you have seen an outflow of people because it's a dangerous time right now.
So we have refreshments in the other room, and you're welcome to go in and help yourself and continue conversation with Daniel. We also have like 4 different stations set up that will help you just kind of express what you felt and heard today. This is one on praying for Putin and the Russian people. There's one on information of how you can act, and that's what y'all are here for, I think, to help us with PDA and what's happening with PDA is the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Program for the National Presbyterian Church, and they have an incredible record for being among the first people there and the last to leave in any disaster in the world. The Baldwins have been involved in that for a long time, and we're grateful for your being here. And Daniel has put together another list of 4 or 5 humanitarian groups that have a really wonderful reputation for getting funds to the people. And that list is in there. There's some fun, just art and your painting that can help you express your prayers and your feelings. And then there's another one over there for how you would maybe hope, where your signs of hope. So you're welcome to explore that. We have a woman who is a caretaker for one of our members, and she is herself from Belarus, but she has family in Ukraine, and her church here is the church that sold the cookies and the food to raise money. And so she and her sister have made Ukrainian cookies for us. So there are some out to help yourself, but then there are little boxes. If you wanted to take one home, there's a basket there if you want to make a donation, and that will go directly to that fund, the church, to send funds to Ukraine. So,
I know I've said a lot of things already, but I just think it's wonderful that we made a connection with the Ukrainian community here. And the list that I put together, they're all Ukrainian organizations. So they are, I think every one of them started after or around the time of the war in 2014. So they've all got some operational experience. They have connections with Ukrainian Americans or Ukrainians in Europe. And so they have good local knowledge and contacts on the ground. And so you can circumnavigate some of the global aid bureaucracy and go directly to putting money in Ukrainian hands. That's why I chose those ones.
I'm grateful. Some of us have already responded to some. So come help yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dana.
Usually everyone votes.